Hello, my name is David Burden from Data Limited, and in this webinar we're going to look at the potential uses of virtual reality within education. For those of you not familiar with us, Data's been around for about 10 years. We're based in the UK, and in that time we've probably done in excess of 50 projects within the 3D immersive learning environment and training space, and those are projects in the UK, the US, Middle East, and across in Asia. So what I want to look at today is, first of all, just giving you a brief overview of our view of virtual reality, and particularly sort of some of the hype that's surrounding that and the pros and cons. Then look at some of the lessons that we can learn from the use of virtual worlds over the last 10 years for delivering 3D immersive education. Then look at the general case for the use of VR in education. And then, as an example, show you the work we're doing around virtual field trips with a project called Fieldscapes, before hopefully drawing some conclusions at the end. There's quite a few sort of attachments and links on the webinar, so copies of the slides and links to videos and also to more information. And if you've got any questions as we go through, then please by all means post those into the system. So first of all, looking at sort of virtual reality and our take on that, we've been playing with Oculus Rift ever since DK1 came out. We do quite a bit of work around Google Cardboard at the moment. And I think the thing is, it very much is a technology which has its pros and its cons. And the big issue, particularly within education at the moment, is what is the relative balance between those. Obviously, on the pro side, there's the hype around it, so a lot of people are interested, a lot of kids are keen to sort of get their hands on the kit and play with it, and it's a real sort of, oh wow, the first time they get to use it. It's a very visceral experience when they're fully immersed with inside the environment. If we start adding audio into that, then that can increase the level of immersion. We're beginning to see some use of handset controllers, although realistically that's more or less limited to Vive at the moment, so we're not seeing much of that, certainly not within UK schools. And then moving forward, the whole sort of social VR space is one that's particularly of interest to us, I suppose, because a lot of our background has been working within social virtual worlds anyway. On the con side of it, quite apart from the fact that kit is still relatively pricey and complex to actually put into a lot of schools, it might just cost you $10 to pick up a Google Cardboard, but then you've got all the hassles of having how many of those do you need for class, where do you get all the phones for it and everything else. Keyboard, lack of keyboard means it's quite hard to actually enter information, so the sorts of tasks or questions where you might want the student to respond to that is quite hard to do in VR. It's quite hard to read any sort of 2D text, so very much the emphasis needs to be on the immersive experience within a relatively natural world rather than getting them to read loads of text inside the space. There's a relatively limited field of view with most of the current VR systems. That in itself means you tend to be moving your head around quite a bit, and I'm sure we're all familiar with issues around sort of latency and motion sickness. And then again, particularly think about a classroom environment. If you've got 20 kids all with VR headsets on, there begins to be a real physical safety issue in terms of actually how you stop all those kids tripping over things and tripping over each other. And then quite apart from the time disorientation of, well, where's the lesson gone once you've actually put your headset on. So I think there's a real balance at the moment that needs to be struck between the pros and the cons side of it before we actually see far more widespread adoption of virtual reality within certainly the UK education system, and I guess the same goes for elsewhere. When we're analysing the VR space, we found this matrix is actually quite useful because there does tend to be a perception in the market, and particularly amongst teachers, no different from anybody else, that they see something like Google Cardboard, particularly something like Google Expeditions, which is probably one of the most prevalent sort of ideas of VR in education. That very much is sitting in that bottom left-hand quadrant, so it's a smartphone device, and it's all about photosphere-type content. And then there is a perception that if all you've got is a smartphone and a Google Cardboard, that's all you can do. Whereas in reality, as long as the phone is up to it and as long as the 3D model is designed correctly, there's no reason why you shouldn't have a full 3D model, fully immersive VR experience delivered through a cardboard and a smartphone. And so that can be a useful stepping stone before you actually move across to Oculus Rift type headsets. And I think the reality of budgets being what they are, we're only going to see a very few of those sorts of integrated head-mounted display type devices in schools for quite a long time. And I think that's one of the challenges of all this is the VR technology, even though it's cheap, even though it's readily available to a consumer, is still quite a long way from being something you would see available in every single class, to use just as and when. And so we need to find some way of coping with that in the short term. One of the things we found has been quite useful to think about the relative pros and cons of photospheres versus 3D models. So a photosphere, obviously quite quick and simple to create. Anybody almost can go out there with a camera or with a camera phone, take the bubble photos and make that available. Generally, they're smaller size downloads, which is always still an issue within schools about bandwidth. The visual quality is obviously very good because it's 100% photorealistic. The big problem is there's not a lot you can do with it other than look at it. You can look around and say, oh, that's pretty. You might be able to put some limited sort of interaction points within the system, but you certainly can't do multi-user. You can't really animate in there, and you can't roam freely about the site. You're limited to the places where the photograph was taken. And that means actually pedagogically within a school, there's only a relatively limited number of ways in which you can actually use that as a resource. One of the nice things about it we found is it is very social, because the natural inclination is to have a look at it yourself and then immediately to pass it on to the person next to you and let them have a look and then pass it around. So it becomes actually social outside of the VR space rather than inside the VR space. The 3D model side of it, obviously the big issue there is actually creating the 3D model in the first place, but obviously that 3D model can be of anything, any place in the universe, any time in history, so you're not limited to just what you can capture with a camera there and then, but you've got to go through that capture process, and that is the biggest problem in terms of trying to create the experience. And also that 3D model can be a far bigger download than we're getting with photospheres, but quite honestly some of the photosphere, particularly the photosphere videos we've seen are of the order of half a gigabyte anyway, which is probably bigger than a lot of the models that we'll use. There also tends to be, school kids tend to have very high expectations when it comes to graphics quality. They've been raised on high-end video games, and so actually if they go into 3D model and it isn't really rich visually, and it's always going to look slightly poor in comparison to something like a photosphere, then it can be quite challenging to them in terms of actually how much they're actually going to buy into it. But as we've seen with Minecraft, actually if you've got the right level of engagement, the graphics quality is not absolutely crucial to the experience. But the nice thing is once you've got that 3D model, then there's a whole variety of different ways you can actually use it within the school and a whole variety of different pedagogies that you can actually support within it. And it is something you can quite easily extend or readily extend to making a VR experience. So, hopefully that just gives you sort of highlights about the differences between that photospheres approach, which I would say probably is accounting for the vast majority of literature we're currently seeing around the moment about the use of VR in schools. And then something more like the 3D model approach. So, as mentioned, we've done a lot of our work inside of virtual worlds. We started off back in 2004 working in Second Life, doing a lot of projects for universities in the UK, the US and around the globe around education, particularly vocational type of education. And obviously there are a lot of other companies who've got a similar sort of heritage to us, in terms of we've been using 3D immersive spaces for an awful long time for educational use. And there's quite a nice little Twitter post there on the bottom right-hand corner that I spotted just the other day that says basically, every SL user, whenever somebody claims their VR experience, is the first time ever it's been done in VR. And almost anybody who's been in SL for a long time and has been doing sort of interesting stuff can say, well, actually, we did that. The only difference is we didn't do it with a headset, but we did it in a fully immersive 3D environment where you've got sort of complete freedom of action and freedom to roam. And for us, probably the three big sort of lessons that came out of that time of developing inside a Second Life type space is, first of all, this one about resolution. Or reality in terms of the quality of the realization of the 3D environment. If the kids are immersed or the students are immersed, then actually they will be quite forgiving about the graphics quality. And as I say, we've seen that most recently with Minecraft. So actually having every single polygon in the scene is not the be-all and the end-all of the education experience. It is about the education experience. The second one is about agency. When you're inside a 3D virtual world that's fully realized, you expect to be able to go sort of almost anywhere in that world and do almost anything you want to within that world. You don't expect to be sort of train-tracked through the educational process. So actually being able to give the student as much freedom as possible within that space, whilst obviously constraining them to the education that you want to deliver, that's one of the ways of actually getting people engaged in the environment. The third lesson, and one of the reasons why particularly Second Life took off, and is still actually being quite heavily used within the educational space, is because it has that ability to allow for self-creation. So if you're a teacher and you want to create a lesson, then there is the technical hurdle of doing that inside Second Life is not insurmountable. And it is the sort of thing which, if you spend a couple of months of an evenings working out how the system works, doing a little bit of scripting, learning a little bit of building, then you can start to create the educational experiences that you want for your kids, or you can begin to show the kids how to do it for themselves. And so that ability to let people to create rather than just giving them a set of pre-canned educational experiences, for us, I think, is one of the key things that came out of, or comes out of our time working within the virtual world space. So if we look at something else that we got involved with, this is 2011. So the Open University in the UK ran a conference called Relive. And one of the things they did there is they ran a Delphic Oracle exercise where they got the teachers and the technologists who were there together and got us to discuss the various topics around what we saw as being the short-term, the medium-term, and the long-term challenges to the use of virtual worlds and 3D immersive spaces within the education environment. And I think, a lot of these actually apply just as well to headset or hardware-based virtual reality. What's interesting is we've had probably more success with the long-term things than we've had with the short-term things. So, long-term, one of the goals that was identified out to 2020 and beyond was all about radical interfaces. But, to a certain extent, we're a long way down the road towards that with things like Oculus Rift and Google Cardboard. So that idea of having VR for $10 was something that in 2011 I don't think anybody really saw coming. Likewise, getting these sorts of environments onto mobile devices, be that through Google Cardboard or just with a hold-in-your-hand type experience. Again, they were seen as being some quite significant challenges to that back in sort of 2011 and just before that. But the power of the tablet PC, the power of the smartphone has moved on significantly. So now almost anything we do within this space, we can deliver it onto a smartphone or we can deliver it onto a tablet. The limitation typically comes down to the memory space and the processing for the size of the environment. So we might use a slightly smaller space or a slightly simpler graphical rendering for the environment on a mobile device, but the same learning experience we can deliver to both. So we've been quite successful on those two, but actually if you look at what was talked about being short-term, one of the big challenges was just making this stuff seamless, by which really it was just easy to do and easy to connect between the different sorts of environments rather than having to jump from one system to another system depending on what sort of learning you wanted to do, and having stuff that did just work. And certainly at the time it was seen that this would almost certainly need to be browser-based, but I think the whole sort of app revolution is beginning to move people away from the browser a bit. There was a sweet spot when we could deliver things like Unity onto the browser, which potentially makes it easier to deploy into schools. But now increasing the move is towards WebGL, and we're not getting quite the same power on WebGL as we would get with, say, Unity plugin. So trying to deliver a rich 3D experience into school through a browser is a bit of a challenge. Although what's interesting is talking to sort of IT departments in schools over the last year or so, actually a lot of them aren't particularly keen on putting stuff through the browser. In terms of actually managing the software, in some ways they would rather have things that they can actually install onto the desktop. They then know exactly how many copies they've got of it. They can lock the browsers down still further, and that's actually an easier way for them to manage the environment. The other thing we identified short-term was this has got to be desirable, and there's got to be a very clear learning benefit. And I think that, again, is something that's coming back again with VR. Everybody can see the wow that you get out of VR initially, but it's how do you sort of prove the long-term impact on attainment and on performance of students and on the quality of learning. And actually, there's still quite a paucity of really good researched work and documented case studies that go a little bit beyond just the sort of the hearsay side of things there in terms of actually what difference can this make to attainment and to achievement. And so it'd be interesting to see a bit more work across the piece within the industry around that side of it. And then just the last one to pick up on the bottom line there was one of the things that was identified medium term was this issue about unification. So actually, how do we unify the system so we don't have to bind to one particular architecture and one particular system? And I think there, again, we're probably not making as much progress as we'd hoped to, and certainly not as much as we made around the mobile and the radical interfaces. So we find this an interesting diagram to sort of pop back to every few years just to see how well things are tracking along what was being talked about. And really, reality is, we're getting the same challenges that we had several years ago. So thinking about virtual reality in education, and there's a whole variety of ways which have been fairly well rehearsed about the potential for the use of VR within the education space. Certainly with headset-based VR, that engagement piece is obviously a very powerful tool to use within the class just to get the kids excited about a particular topic. before you then might move on to some slightly more sort of traditional training or traditional learning in order to go into the detail. And certainly if you're using something like Google Cardboard, you really are talking about a few minutes worth of engagement before the kids really sort of typically want to move on to something else, or it needs to be passed on to the next person in class. As I say, in relation to the virtual world work, one of the things that this type of environment does really well is that interactivity, and particularly where it's non-linear and where the student has agency. So a lot of traditional e-learning can be very tedious. It really is tick through screen after screen after screen. You've got limited numbers of options, as soon as you move on through a dialogue or something like that. Whereas within a VR or a virtual world type space, then you can actually really open things out and give the kids far more, or the students far more potential in terms of what they can do and how they can engage within that space. But that in itself obviously raises significant issues potentially around actually how you author an environment like that. Looking at whether or not these experiences are teacher-led or student-led, so basically who is actually guiding the process. And one of the things we've been involved with is actually looking at the way in which you can actually, if you put the teacher into the environment, and particularly for something like a virtual field trip, so you actually have the field tutor inside that environment showing the students around, rather than something that's predominantly a solo exercise where the student is in there learning something, but they're not really interacting with the teacher other than back through the physical space. And that also leads on to the idea about collaborative exercises. Again, very little in the way of e-learning is actually truly collaborative, whereas in the VR space, we can put a number of students into that environment. They can interact with that environment, and they can team up to actually complete a task within that space. And certainly the thing that we've been focused on, as I'll come on to talk about, is around how we can use VR to augment what you're doing in the physical world. And it says physical trips there, but it needn't necessarily be a trip. It could just be anything that you're doing as part of physical training. So, for instance, one of the exercises we've done a couple of times is doing virtual laboratories, where, say, a university has very limited time for their students inside the lab, so they need them to be able to perform fairly fast once they get into that lab. So what you can do is we can use the VR space to recreate the experiment and the bench and all the kits, so the students can actually practice on that ahead of the lab time. So when they go into the lab, they know exactly what they're doing. They know how things connect. They know how to interact with the device. They can be productive during the lab time. And then afterwards, when it comes to revision, they can dive back into that virtual lab just to remember actually how the experiment went. So there's a lot of ways that we can use VR to augment physical learning rather than to replace physical learning. And then, as the title to this presentation suggested, the idea about using VR to create all those things which are sort of just not possible in real life. Be that whether off-world experiences, visiting different planets, exploring things at different scales, so putting you inside a human body or a human cell, or exploring differences in time, so going back to the Romans or something like that. All of those sorts of things are just as easy to do effectively in virtual reality as a replica of the outside world, outside the classroom. And what we find in a lot of the work we've done is about using the VR to understand the context. And again, we're seeing this in virtual field trips, where typically the students will go to one small location. They'll be there for a couple of hours. They won't really stray more than a couple of kilometers from the minibus. By actually giving them that VR experience, it means they can actually explore the area around them and understand the context of what they're learning that much better. And as I've already alluded to, the idea about using these virtual environments for revision afterwards, or if you've missed a trip or missed an exercise in the lab or anything else like that, you've still got that chance to catch up and do it at a later date. So there's a whole variety of different ways, quite sort of almost all of them subject independent, in which we can look at use of VR in education. But in terms of challenges, and I've already alluded to quite a few of these, there is equipment issues, and that could be whether it's just providing the mobile phones, smartphones. If you're using Google Cardboard, it could just be making sure that the PCs within the school are up to power for actually running these sorts of environments. Bandwidth is often an issue in schools, so if you're relying on any sort of video streaming or download of large terrain files, understanding how best to manage that is something that's of concern. Health and safety, again, I've talked about the issues around health and safety. Almost anywhere I've been to so far where there's been anybody using a VR headset, there's normally been a minder there just to make sure they don't trip over or bump into things. And there's different issues with that if you start to scale that up within a school context. One of the big things we've learned over the last few years in particular is that for teachers, the wow isn't necessarily enough. What they really do need is they need to have content which is very specific to the curriculum. Certainly in the UK, they need to know exactly sort of which paragraph of the exam this particular VR experience is going to help their students with, because the timetable is so pressured. There isn't a lot of time left for sort of pure sort of explorations of, oh, wouldn't it be nice to type exercises. So where we are looking at using VR, we need to try and go beyond that sort of wow to actually working out where this stuff plays into the curriculum requirement. And likewise, we need to make sure that the teacher themselves has time to master this. If they're going to be using this in a lesson, they need to be 100% confident with how it's going to work and how they're going to use it in the lesson. And that also comes on to this issue about it needs to fill that whole lesson, or they need to understand how it contributes to the whole lesson. There might be some scope for it as a sort of 5-minute wow, let's do this to get excited and to get interested, but really they need something that's going to have longevity through the whole of the syllabus and be able to support the learning through the whole of the lesson rather than just that initial 5 minutes. And, if we're going to start to meet these very specific requirements for the teachers, then realistically it's only going to be the teachers themselves who can put the content into that environment. So what we do need to do is have a look at how we can provide the tutors with the authoring tool. Someone's just asking if there's any book publishers working on VR curriculum. Not that I'm aware of. Certainly one of the things we're doing is we are talking to the awarding bodies in the UK so as to show them the sort of things we're doing. Certainly a number of them are interested in what's happening in that VR space. And so what I certainly hope over the next few years we'll begin to see the curriculum taking more note of what can be done within the VR environment. So what I want to do now, as sort of a bit of a case study, effectively, is talk about the work we're doing with Fieldscapes. So the Fieldscapes project is funded by Innovate UK, which is the UK government's innovation agency. Dayton is the lead on it. We're working with the Open University and the Field Studies Council and also design thinkers to put the system together. And just as a bit of background, this project came out of something called Virtual Skiddaw, which was a project that we did in Unity for the Open University back in 2013. As you can see from the screenshots there, it was designed to be accessed through an ordinary PC or through a tablet, and typically the user is represented by an avatar, although they can switch into first-person mode. And we did actually do a prototype of this running on Oculus Rift on DK1, so as to get the VR type experience. And it was very much intended to support their students who are going on a physical field trip, so they could actually prepare for that field trip, and then when they return for the field trip, they could use it to support revision. But we found it worked really nicely. The issue was how do you scale that up, and how do you get that to almost every school in the country, covering a whole variety of different lessons. So we were fortunate through Innovate UK to get some funding initially for feasibility and now for full development work to really look at building a system that we can make available on a commercial basis to effectively almost anyone, be it a school or an organisation, to use to actually author and deliver virtual learning experiences, either delivered through a flat interface or through a VR headset type interface. And so we're now working with quite a number of schools and universities and other stakeholders in the UK and also abroad to actually work out what needs to go into this. And quite honestly, we're now a good way through it. So it's now very much a question about tuning the way it works to make it something that is hopefully really easy to use by a whole variety of different organisations. And the way the system itself works, it's hosted on the cloud. And the big issue with any sort of full VR environment for education is how do you create the actual 3D landscape or the 3D location. And that is always going to be a challenge. So we're not actually doing anything innovative there at all, but what we're saying is basically if you can get a landscape or a location to this sort of level of standard within Unity, then you can bring it into our system. Because the fact is that once you've got a landscape in, then actually you can probably deliver dozens, if not hundreds, of different lessons all using that one landscape. Because there are a whole variety of different perspectives you can view it from, be it from a geology or a geography perspective, a biology perspective, a history perspective, a tourism perspective, a sports perspective. So it is a question for us of let's find nice simple ways of letting people get those landscapes up into the Fieldscapes environment, but then give teachers a really nice, easy to use tool that lets them actually create the lessons that they actually want to do onside that environment, within that environment. So that is very much about what we're focusing on this project, is creating that pedagogic layer, or a tool to create that pedagogic layer that the teachers can use once they've been given a landscape or a set of landscapes to choose from. For the student experience, the student has the choice about whether or not they're experiencing this in a non-VR mode, just through a desktop or through a tablet computer, or whether they want to put on the VR headset, and we'll support initially both Cardboard and Oculus Rift. But fundamentally, the learning experience is identical, although you may want to design it slightly differently for VR use in terms of things like the ability to read text and the like. But we've got the flexibility within the editor to let you do that. And as it says there, it's both single and multi-user. And then there's an assignment management app built into the system that lets you create the classes, create the assignments, so that when the students log on, basically all they get presented to you or presented to them are the assignments that they've actually got to do. Someone's asking about VR creations converting to 3D printable models. Really, that's got nothing to do with whether it's a VR creation. That's purely to do with what that 3D model is. So typically what you would do is you would use a tool like 3D Studio Max or Maya to create that 3D landscape. Once you've got that 3D model, you can then either send it to a printer to print it out, or you could drop it into a Unity type environment to then load it up into Fieldscapes. So both the 3D model and the VR environment both share the same model. It's just used in slightly different ways. And one of the things that we found when we've been putting Fieldscapes together has been very useful. It's something that we did probably 8 or 9 years ago now, which was beginning to look at these immersive learning experiences in terms of what's called e-drama. So rather than thinking of it again in a very linear e-learning type approach, we thought of it far more as being, what would this be like as a drama? So we talk about having a set, which is that landscape. That's where the play, if you like, or the learning exercise is going to take place. We have the props, so those are the things that you actually have within that environment that the student is actually going to interact with. You then have the script, which is really a definition of how the student can interact with the props. It's not a linear script in the traditional sense. And then you have the actors, which are typically the user avatar, but certainly in due course could well also be non-player characters. So this hopefully begins to move people away from thinking about a very linear, very custom experience. And this idea of, well, actually, if you've got a set, there's lots of different things you can do with that set, just depending on what sort of props you bring into the environment. And you don't write a very linear script exercise. All you're doing is thinking about what are the different sorts of interactions that the students might be able to have within that. So as a bit of a taster for sort of what we're doing, we actually put a couple of apps up on the Play Store, and you can search for those after the session if you want. One of them is called Fieldscapes VR. The other one is called Carding Mill VR. In fact, I'll add a link to that later on. And these are both Google Cardboard apps, and one of them is a 3D model of the Carding Mill Valley, which is what we're using as the basis for some of our initial field trips. And the second one is a photosphere model. So actually it gives you a chance to directly compare the same location and the VR experience through a 3D model and the VR experience through a set of photospheres. We've had that up for a while, but just to give you a better sense of what Fieldscapes itself looks like, I'm just going to run two very short videos, one to show you the sort of the user experience end, and then the second one so as to show you the editor end. So I'll just set this running, and hopefully the quality at your end won't be too bad. So this is actually part of an education lesson that runs on the moon. And to say, the important thing to remember is all the interactivity you're seeing here is actually defined by the authoring tool. So there's nothing that's hard-coded, if you like, into the system at all. So we can define interactions that happen when the sort of student walks up to a piece of equipment. We can turn on and turn off the indicators. We can show bits of text. We can show bits of images. We can even show sort of pieces of video. We've got Armstrong stepping off the lunar lander included in this. They can actually interact with the items in the environment. We can bring up different overlays. So in this case, what we're doing is we're bringing up an overlay that shows exactly where the astronauts themselves walked on the moon. And you'll also see there we've got a whole menu that's popped up on the left-hand side that shows the student various things that they can do to control the environment. And even that menu is being defined by the authoring program. And as I say, that's very much a third-person experience, but we can quite easily turn that into first-person or we can put a VR headset on and experience it. So this is showing you the authoring side. So although this is running on Unity, the idea is that the tutor or whoever's creating the exercise never sees anything to do with Unity whatsoever. So hopefully we've created a user interface that's relatively straightforward and easy for them to use. So what I'm doing here is I'm choosing a prop from a list of items there, and we have a variety of props to support different sorts of subjects and different sorts of learning exercises. I just click on a prop from the list to put it into the world. I can drag it around inside that space, and we make sure the prop's terrain follows, so there's no danger of losing a prop sort of underground or anything else like that. This prop actually sort of turns to face you depending on where you are. And then what I then do is I just double click on a prop, and then I can then define exactly how I want the student to be able to interact with that prop. And there's really typically three main interactions we find that count within the virtual world. There's going up and touching an object, so clicking on it, there's colliding with it, and there's detecting it. And those are fundamentally the sort of the fundamental interactions you have within any sort of 3D space. So what we're doing is we're just defining for each or for one of those, all of those, exactly what we want the prop to do, either to itself or to any part of the environment, or even to the avatar, to actually show what happens when they do that particular interaction. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose to display, if the student collides with this object, I want to display a pop-up display, and I can then put in the text that I want to have displayed. Type the text in, just change what the button's going to say on the bottom. I can preview it, and then I can save that, all that information, and then I can dive directly into test mode so as to actually try that interaction out. So click on test, and now I can actually test it out, and sure enough, as I walk and collide with that particular sign, then my warning pops up. So, hopefully it's a very simple way to author that experience, and the idea is that once you've created that, you basically push it straight up to the Fieldscape system. That can be shared with anybody else, so they can actually make changes to it if they want to, and if you're going to let them do it, so they can customize it for what they want to do, and then it could be made available to use in assignments and passed straight down to students, either through a tablet or a PC, smartphone, or through a VR headset. And for us, that's actually been the key thing, is actually this making it something that ordinary teachers can actually get involved with. And just talking about sort of landscape creation, this is something we're just doing at the moment. We talked about having field trips anywhere, including Mars. So this is a bit of work we're doing at the moment. So we found quite a nice image, top left there, of a chunk of Mars. We then found somebody actually done a nice height map on it. So it took, in a course of about an afternoon, we were able to take that height map, bring that into Unity, begin to smooth the environment out, put a decent-looking set of textures and images on it, and almost by the end of the afternoon, we had something that was certainly usable to give the students an idea of actually being on a real piece of Mars and begin to actually explore almost some of the real geography of Mars. And so the process for doing that is something that we'll document on our website, so as to hopefully anybody who could reasonably technically literate can actually get to grips with doing that much on Unity, and then being able to make that landscape available on the rest of the Fieldscape system. So really, just to sort of conclude, there's been a fair sort of gallop through stuff there. And so, in terms of VR, there is definitely something there, but I think we do need to be very cautious of the hype, particularly when we talk about trying to use this inside of schools, where there are all sorts of challenges, both technical and pedagogical, to using this, and health and safety, to using this sort of technology. And realistically, at the moment, we need to see it as being part of a spectrum or continuum. And the important thing, I think, is about 3D immersive learning inside of schools. And if we can deliver some of those experiences through non-hardware-based flat screen interactions, and some of them through VR headsets, then that's actually going to be far more successful than just saying this is something that really only is there to be experienced on a VR headset and nothing more. It's going to be a long time, I think, before that becomes a viable position to be able to take. And also, if you look at when students are learning, they're learning on the bus, they're learning on the train, they're learning sat in front of a telly. All of those are not situations when you could be using your VR headset realistically. As mentioned, we need to make sure that we're addressing the whole lesson. It's not just a wow 5-minute engagement. but it is something that can contribute to the whole of the lesson. And it may well be it's a question of it may be a relatively short VR experience, but we also need to provide the documentation that goes alongside that, so the PDFs of worksheets and things like that, or quizzes that can go alongside with the piece. In terms of experiences that are, let's say, they need to be linked to the curriculum in order to make an impact, because certainly for teachers, they tend to be very time pressured. They're going to prefer to have stuff where they know exactly where it links into what the awarding bodies are actually looking for. And certainly that's one of the things we're doing with Fieldscapes is letting exercises be tagged, to which examining boards and which exams they're very much focused on. And as I mentioned, schools are very tough IT and user environments. You've got a demanding bunch of users there who've got experience of a lot of high-end games and have relatively high expectations of what they're going to see. And Google Cardboards as cardboard are probably not going to survive very long within a school-type environment. And finally, it is very much, I think teachers know best. They know what they want to have in that lesson, and that's why places like Second Life have been so successful for teaching, is because it let them actually get in there and building it. And I think, we need to carry that across into VR as well. We need to be able to give the teachers the tools that lets them actually build the lesson around what they feel they need to deliver to their kids. And if we can find a nice way of letting them then share that lesson to a wide variety of other users, then that's definitely, to us, has got to be the way to go. So that's all I want to go through. So I think we've probably got about 9 minutes or so to sort of deal with any questions. As I say, in the attachments, we've got copies of links to videos and links to documentation. So please have a look and see what's on there. In terms of questions, somebody's asking about exporting art out of VR. I must admit that's not our piece at all. So we're very much about, bringing those 3D models into VR and then positioning those 3D models within the space rather than trying to export that out. I think there's another presentation, this morning on social VR that was talking about tilt brush and the like, and you're probably best off sort of directing that question there, and that's not very much, that's not the space we're in. So are there any other questions that we can deal with in the last few minutes? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for all joining in. I hope you've got something useful out of that. So it's a bit of a quick canter through, but gives you a sense, as I say, certainly for us, about, to us, VR is nothing significantly new. It's a different way of accessing these 3D immersive environments. And yes, there are some particular features of it that we need to consider in order that the exercise works best. But otherwise, a lot of the principles, I think, of how we ought to be using these spaces, the sort of things that we ought to do, have been well established and well researched over the last decade or so, probably. And so we do well to sort of learn some of those lessons and then bring the best elements of that forward into our use of VR, and obviously very much identify the unique affordances of VR that then can bring to these environments as well. Okay, with that, thank you very much. If anybody's got any other sort of final questions after the session, then I'll just put my contact details up there on the screen. So by all means, email me or follow us either on Facebook or on Twitter, and go to the website or onto the attachments to have a look at the videos. We're posting probably a video a week at the moment up onto Facebook to show the sort of things that we're doing with Fieldscapes. And Fieldscapes will actually be opening for a beta trial at the beginning of October. So again, if anybody would like to take part in that beta, then please drop me a line at david.burden@daden.co.uk, and we'll try and get you involved. Okay, with that, thanks so much, and I'll end the presentation. Goodbye.